Chapter 7. When they brought him his fine new livery, blue with brass buttons, they wondered why he was sat, crouched on his bare bed, with his knees drawn up like battlements before his face, and they remarked when they left him, on the look in his eyes as he watched them come and go, dismay and despair. They laughed on the way downstairs, but not unkindly, and decided his system was still shocked from his washing. Give him another half hour and he'll be trying on his new clothes and strutting like the king of the weasels. But after half an hour there was no change, save that, maybe, Smith's head was sunk a little lower and his eyes stared with a deeper despair. His livery was untouched, and the sheet that covered him had slipped an inch or two off his shoulders, leaving those thin objects to fend for themselves against the cold air. "Maybe he's taken a chill," suggested the housekeeper, and rummaged in her wits for a remedy. "But he ain't flushed or feverish. He looks more froze than inly heated." Miss Mansfield came to see him. She scowled angrily at his sick, despairing air. "Are you ill, Smith? What's wrong with you? Answer me." "Nothing, miss, nothing." She went away, much troubled, and ordered blankets to be taken up and Smith to be wrapped inside them. Several times during the afternoon she returned, hoping against hope to find him restored, but each time he seemed more sunk within himself, as if something necessary had perished inside, and all was sinking inwards for lack of support. She questioned the 4 footmen and consulted with the housekeeper, who gave it as her opinion that the child had been poisoned by too much sulphur, and offered to prepare a draught. Gladly, Miss Mansfield agreed. The draught was mixed and carried upstairs. "Come, Smith, this will make you well again." But it was no use. He'd neither take draught nor anything else to sustain him. "It's as if," said the housekeeper quietly, "that poor mite has made up his mind to die." "What an idea! Scowl and frown as you please, miss, but I've seen it happen. These little souls of the town perish like you and I go to sleep." And so it began to seem to all at the Vine Street household, save Mr. Mansfield himself, from whom it was desperately kept, as was the late visit of a physician, brought in against all dignity through the tradesman's door with much secrecy and quiet. He studied Smith, felt his head, his wrist, his chest, bade Smith look this way, look that way, and to a point above his head. Wearily Smith obliged, and everywhere his eyes turned they seemed to see even more misery, as if there was no end, no bottom to it. The physician shook his head. In all justice, he could find nothing wrong, but in all compassion and pity there was something grievously amiss. But it was out of his scope to find it. He spread his hands, pocketed his fee, and left. More and more Miss Mansfield blamed herself. Had not the child been bright and well before his violent washing? But to her father's repeated inquiries, she answered cheerfully, "He's quite worn out from the footman's labour, sir. I fancy he'll sleep the clock round. Best not disturb him yet." During the evening, Mr. Billing called. Mr. Billing was a youngish attorney, and was both Mr. Mansfield's friend and also deeply in love with his daughter. Mr. Mansfield had high hopes of a marriage, but he feared his daughter would never leave Vine Street as long as he lived. She always laughed when he brought up the matter, and declared that Mr. Billing was so agreeable as suitor that it would be a shame to bury him in a husband. Mr. Mansfield would have dearly liked to have seen his daughter's face when she spoke so lightly, if only to see if her eyes were filled with regretful tears. But on this evening Miss Mansfield found the attorney tiresome and overstaying his welcome. She longed to creep up to the top of the house and see the strange, sad child. She had a terrible feeling that he'd die in the night. Mr. Billings stayed and stayed, affable and talkative as ever, and all the while she longed to cry out, "Begone! Begone! There's a dying boy upstairs, and I must go to him." Instead, she helped him to port and brandy as her father directed, and never left the room for an instant, being afraid of arousing her father's suspicions that all was not well with Smith. She chatted as amiably as she was able, and hoped her suitor would read the anxious impatience in her eyes. But unluckily, Mr. Billing was so used to Miss Mansfield's varied and odd expressions, and thought, though he loved each and all of them, he took no particular note of any. Below stairs, all but two of the servants had gone to bed. A dozing footman and a certain scullery maid called Meg, a soft-hearted person with large arms and the colour of boiled lobsters. All the evening her muddled motherly mind had been fixed on the sick child at the top of the house, and a certain notion had come to her. Knowing that the boy had been brought up in an ale cellar, she supposed he was homesick for familiar things. She brooded on this till there was no one about to question her, and she crept up to Smith with a pint of ale. Not that she supposed he'd drink it, but she firmly believed that the sight and smell of it would do his aching heart a power of good. Smith stared up at her mournfully. Her heart was fairly unwrung. She moved about the tiny room to spread the ale's odours. Smith watched her. She smiled and held out the tankard. "Come along, little one. It'll do you a power of good. Drink it up, for not the Red Lion itself has a better ale." Smith gazed at her sombrely. "Nothing but kindness is meant. All's for your own good. They'll feel and clothe you and treat you like a human being. You'll want for naught here." Smith looked as though all he ever wanted was to pass unhindered away. Meg's eyes grew great with tears. "They had to wash you. You was that black. You should have seen the sheets. The sheets, did you see 'em?" For the first time, Smith showed signs of interest in the world. His nose twitched and his eyes began to kindle. "The ale," thought Meg triumphantly. "It's the smell of the ale that's doing it." "Why, bless you, yes, and they was that horrible Miss wanted 'em burned." "And did you?" "Law, no. Burn good sheets? I biled 'em." At this, Smith stared at her so strangely she began to fidget. Was there anything else with the sheets? Obligingly, Meg shut her eyes to recall the scene. "There was a handkerchief, but 'twas so far gone, I burned it." "Burned it?" Here Smith gave such a shriek and groan that Meg thought it was his last moment was come. "I had to, little one. 'Twas an unshameful state. It smelled, dear, like... Well, I don't know what it smelled like, for I've naught to compare it with. Powerful, clinging. I only hope it'll wear off off the master's paper." "Paper?" whispered Smith, not daring to hope, and yet not being able to prevent it. "What paper?" His eyes glittered so brilliantly, and he had begun to shiver so violently that Meg edged away, fearing a contagious mortal fever. "Why, one of the master's documents that had somehow got itself muddled up in the dreadful handkerchief. Sometimes he drops his papers in the queerest places, what with his disability. What was in it? Lord, child, I don't know. 'Twas a lawyer's document of sorts, and no one must read them save the mistress or the master's clerk, and then only when the master asks." "Then how do you know it was a lawyer's document?" Smith said this with desperate sharpness, for he was coming back to life with a vengeance. Meg, seeing nothing but the boy's improvement and wanting to humour him, smiled confidentiality. 'Twas marked for the attorneys, Billing and Leonard, with whom we have dealings." She sighed sentimentally. "Billing and cooing, I call 'em, on account of Mr. Billing being sweet on Miss Mansfield. He's in the parlour now, such a handsome pair." Her smile grew soft and misty. Then she remembered Miss Smith's question. "So what else could it have been but one of the master's documents? Answer me that." Dazedly, Smith nodded. What else could it have been but one of the magistrate's documents? For what would a light-fingered alley scuttler like Smith be doing with a document marked for a lawyer? Did you give it to him? To our Mr. Billing? Law, no, that's for the master to do. Besides, it were for the other one, for Mr. Leonard. So you gave it to Mr. Mansfield? Questions. Was you a cat? You'd be stone dead. No, I never gave it to him. Why, it smelled so bad it would have knocked him flat. What with the disability and all, I had put it in his study along with his other papers. only I put it at the bottom so the smells might wear off before he comes to it. That's what makes a good servant," she added proudly. "Consideration for a master's feelings. Oh, there's a good lad. Drunk up that your ale. Just homesick, weren't you? Knew it would all the time. Trust Meg." She repeated this several times with some triumph, then beamed encouragingly at Smith and left the room. On the way downstairs she sniffed and tossed her head in high contempt and muttered, "Chills and fevers and sulphury poisonings. Homesick. Ha! And it took a motherly soul like Meg to see it. Brains, give you a farthing for 'em." She prodded the snoozing footman and boasted of Smith's improvement. "A touch of art," she said. "That's all this big busy town has need of. Take that boy, for instance." It was now midnight, and to Miss Mansfield's aggravation and distress, Mr. Billings stayed for another hour. Then at last he went, and when her father was safely in bed, she flew upstairs with an anguished heart, expecting she knew not what. She opened the door, she looked inside, and she all but dropped her candle. The room was empty. The boy was gone. Her face grew pale with dread. A terrible fear assailed her. The boy, feeling himself to be dying, had struggled from his bed and crept from the house. The housekeeper's grim words echoed in her mind. These little souls of the town perish easily. In blackest despair, she began to go downstairs. Suddenly she stopped. She heard a voice, a very gentle, very subtle, very secretive, a papery rustle from her father's study. She approached the door. She was much frightened and would have aroused the house, but an odd instinct prevented her. She opened the door. She held up the candle. "Smith! Oh my gosh, I'm done for." The floor about Mr. Mansfield's desk looked as though it had been snowed on by documents. Depositions, confessions, summonses, and judgments lay in a guilty profusion, and in the midst of them crouched Smith, wearing only his shirt and looking like an outsized document himself, with his face turned up like a grey seal of terror. All Miss Mansfield's dread and anguish turned now into a violent fury and bitterness. "Smith! Is this how you repay Mr. Mansfield, by robbing him, stealing from a blind man? Is this the kindness of your heart that so moved him? Nothing but the cunning skill of a cruel rogue." She spoke in a trembling whisper, for she dared not awake her father. Smith, still among the documents, stared up at her with a mixture of misery and fear. He had not yet found his precious document, which he knew he'd have recognised even among the hundreds he'd strewn about. Now he was done for. Flight was impossible. Miss Mansfield stood in the doorway, and the builder had provided no other way out. He wondered what would be done with him. The worst he could count on was being taken and hanged for a thief, the best to be sent furiously out into the night. Either way, the document was lost forever. I ain't cruel," he mumbled unhappily. "Really, I ain't." Miss Mansfield bit on her lip. She scowled, and her face in the candlelight looked like a small thundercloud. Fiercely, she continued to stare at the unlucky Smith. "Really? What could one expect of such a child? All his life a thief?" She began to grow angry with her father again. He ought to have expected something like this. He was so foolishly sentimental. Just because the boy showed him a kindness when any other wretch would have robbed him and left him for dead, why should he think Smith was exceptional and reformed? Stupid idea. As if such a boy would change in an evening. It takes time, and her father of all people should have known. Miss Mansfield's breast began to heave with aggravation, and Smith watched her piteously. Her father was outrageous. Always he expected her to have the patience of a saint. Well, she hadn't. She was peevish, and now he'd left her to deal with the wretched boy while he slept on in happy ignorance. "Oh, Smith," she said at length, scowling words worse than ever under the strain of her long inner quarrel. I'm disappointed, it's true, but you're fortunate that Mr. Mansfield is more understanding than his daughter. She, I promise you, would have had you clapped straight into Newgate. But Mr. Mansfield never expected an angel out of you all at once. Mr. Mansfield's a saint, Smith, and on that account you may thank your stars. Go back to bed this instant, and we'll say no more of tonight. But if I catch you doing any such thing again, then it's Newgate for you, my lad.